Well, good afternoon, ladies and gentlemen, and welcome back. Delighted that we now have a panel which is extraordinarily close to my heart as someone who calls himself first and foremost an African, and that is tackling the conservation crisis caused by COVID. And to join me in discussing that, I have three really interesting panelists, and all of them have, I think, very important things to say about the current crisis, and it is definitely a crisis. First, I've got Max Gomera, who's currently the director of the UN Environment, Biodiversity and Ecosystems branch. He's over 20 years of national and international experience in natural resources management. I have Judy, Kepher, Gona in Nairobi. Judy is the founder of Sustainable Travel and Tourism Agenda, an organization that uses education, which I know we all understand is vital, research, advocacy, and training to promote sustainable tourism. And then finally, John Scanlon, who is a special envoy with African Parks. John is a seasoned leader in the fields of conservation, environment, and sustainable development. And as far as I can tell from his background CV, has worked just about everywhere that is important to the topic of conservation. So really interesting individuals with us. Max, firstly, good afternoon. Thanks so much for joining us. Max, is it an overstatement to say that conservation is in crisis at the moment?
Thank you, Nick, and thank you for having me on this program. No, I don't think it's an overstatement, actually. And as we have seen across Africa, conservation really is in crisis. Whether you're looking at the vast plains of the Masai Mara in Kenya, through to the world's largest elephant sanctuary in the Kavango Zambezi Transfrontier Park, where incidentally we are dealing with the mysterious death of elephants, or indeed the Virunga Park, where measures to shield mountain gorillas from the coronavirus have resulted in a slump in vital revenue from visitors. The conservation enterprise is facing a very serious crisis. So it is not an understatement. There's a problem there and we've got to deal with it.
And Max, just to get to the heart of this, because I know this is a topic that you've talked on extensively. I mean, COVID is a zoonotic disease. This is really a consequence of the decimation of natural habitat, human encroachment, the illegal trade in wildlife. Is this a crisis that was a natural consequence of what we as humans are doing to our environment, and how do we reverse this, or how do we sort of stop what we're doing, reflect, and say maybe we need to do things differently? I mean, can we do that?
Well, in terms of the coronavirus specifically, the science is out there and people are still looking into the direct cause of this. But in terms of zoonotic diseases more broadly, the scientific opinion is that our actions as humans are resulting in an increase in the probability of transmission of disease from animals to humans, whether that is diseases such as Ebola, whether that is malaria, or any of the zoonotic diseases that we've seen out there. And what's driving it is changes in land use, which is bringing people into direct contact with disease-causing pathogens and animals that may be reservoirs for diseases. So whether we're building cities or whether we're finding land for producing the food that we need to feed 7 billion people on the planet, the actions that we're taking as humans are bringing us into dangerous contact with wildlife. And that can change.
Judy, perhaps I can turn to you, because I know that ecotourism, sustainability are very close to your heart, but I know that fundamental to that is education. how important and are we doing enough to educate people about the consequences of these actions, or is it really a question of the fundamentals of rural poverty, of the fact that so many people have so little, and we're just not channeling resources in the right direction or bringing community-based programs to bear effectively enough? Do you know, your situation in Nairobi, you're right in the heart of East Africa. How comfortable are you that what's being done is what should be done, and what do you think needs to change?
Thank you, Nick, for that question. I think a lot of effort has been put in education around wildlife in Africa. If the number of NGOs working in this area is anything to go by, nobody would doubt that effort has been put in education. But the tragedy is that despite this amount of effort being put and the millions of shillings or dollars or whatever currency we want to use that has gone into this, it becomes very difficult to find a balance. What impact has this created? I think that is the big question. The fact that education is happening is not the question. The big question is, has it had impact? And if it has had impact, why are we losing wildlife? Why is our species numbers going down? Why are we losing space that should be available for wildlife? And we know that one of the biggest threats to wildlife conservation is Africa. In Africa, it's actually loss of space for wildlife, for competing uses and other uses. So with all this education, where is the disconnect that does not add up so that we have that level of appreciation? One of the things that I believe is the challenge for wildlife conservation in Africa, and which has created part of this disconnect between education and reality, has been the connection of wildlife and its attractiveness to tourism. That link has been a dangerous link. It is a desirable link. In every conversation, everybody asks the question, so why, how else? And I'm glad that Maxwell tell us that there are innovative ways to finance conservation, because this has been the dangerous link, that the education has been tagged to wildlife, its attractiveness, and therefore tourism. So without tourism, then we don't see the value of wildlife conservation. And if you look at the type of conservation education that goes on, whether we are talking wildlife-based enterprises, which are mainly tourism, they are always linked somehow to tourism. And tourism is a seasonal business in Africa. It's not a full-time business in Africa. So if you want to continuously link wildlife conservation and tourism, you're creating a very unstable industry for conservation, because it is defined by the seasonality of tourism. And tourism seasonality depends on so many things. Today, as we speak here, it has been affected by COVID-19. Sometimes it is just affected by weather because it is summer in some place and winter in another place. Sometimes it is affected by political instability in one country and not in another one. Sometimes it is affected by foreign policy on where you can go and where you cannot go and where citizens can travel. So anchoring our conservation, wildlife conservation in Africa on tourism has created instability in wildlife conservation in Africa, to the extent that we are talking about a crisis now, but we can confidently say that wildlife conservation has been in perpetual crisis in Africa. It's been a perpetual state of crisis, from one issue aggravating the crisis often, like now it's been aggravated by COVID-19, but we are in a perpetual state of crisis when it comes to conservation. The politics behind it, behind wildlife, and probably we'll be talking about the curse of the plenty. There is value in wildlife, and it has suffered the curse of the plenty, especially when it comes to policy. Our policies that are made around wildlife, and even how you see the departments of wildlife. I will use the example of Kenya. The Department of Wildlife keeps shifting. It is linked to tourism. Why? Why should it be a tourism and wildlife department? Why is it not linked to environment? Why is it not linked to forestry? One time it is in environment, another time it is in forestry, another time it is in natural resources, the next time it is in tourism. It even creates the impression that the states themselves, most of them are not sure how to handle this resource. They don't know whether it's a resource by itself, or they don't know whether it's part of tourism. They don't understand whether it's part of the natural environment and so should go along with forestry department. They just don't know what type of resource this wildlife is. And so we have been in a perpetual a state of crisis for our wildlife. Today, I would repeat the same things. You mentioned at some point that somehow I was inspired by people like Martha Honey when she wrote her book. Professor Martha Honey, when she wrote her book, Ecotourism and Sustainable Development, Who Owns Paradise? And probably the crisis has also been about ownership between government, between communities, between organizations, national, regional, and international, that are claiming a stake, making wildlife conservation actually a contested space in Africa. And that contestation is part of the crisis, amongst the other crises that I have mentioned.
Judy, that leads me to a question perhaps for John. John, you've obviously spent a lot of time with some of the big UN agencies. I was struck by what Inga Anderson said 2 days ago about the sort of what she called the triple planetary threat of climate, nature, and pollution at the speech at the UNEP. So, you know, there's evidence that people are talking very openly about this crisis, and I agree with Judy. As someone who's been traveling in Africa for 50 years, you know, to me, this has been something that we've all known about, and it does feel like this is an aggravator, the COVID situation, as opposed to, you know, and an accelerator potentially of the crisis. To Judy's point about this linkage between what governments do and tourism, is this a funding challenge in the sense that I know you've worked when you were at the UNEP with IATA, with the WTTC, you know, these are industry bodies that are inherently representing aviation, travel and tourism. So those links are quite established. Two questions for you. One, to Judy's point, is that a good thing? And two, you know, can we actually rely on the leaders of airlines, hotel companies, tour operators to really deal with this from a sort of threat perspective? Are these the right people that we should be engaging with to try and solve this problem? Or is it simply we have no one else to engage with because we don't have funding, and if we don't get the industry that is most likely to fund it to start throwing cash at us, then we don't actually have any solution at all, because no government is going to fund the solution.
Yeah, thanks, Nick, and thanks for the invitation to join you today. Look, I think funding nature conservation is a challenge across every continent, not just the African continent. And wildlife-based tourism has been part of the mix for generating financing for conservation across every continent as well. I think what distinguishes Africa is the extent of reliance that's been placed upon wildlife-based tourism, as Judy said. And it's basically been this direct relationship between nature conservation, wildlife-based tourism, and the financing it provides. Now that's come into view very starkly now, because wildlife tourism's come to an end. And all of a sudden the financing for conservation has come to an end. and yet we put all the eggs in one basket. So what are we to do? How are we going to look forward? I think that wildlife-based conservation will continue to be a very important part of the mix on the African continent going forward, and also across every other continent. It's one of the few ways you can actually generate revenue through conservation. But we have to look at it much more broadly than that. And this is something that Max has been doing at the UNEP, Inger Anderson and others, talking about, recalibrating our relationship with nature, understanding the benefits of nature. And I think one thing that this COVID-19 pandemic has done, as devastating as it's been, is forced us to rethink. Nature conservation is not just about conservation. It's about biodiversity, everything biodiversity gives us. It's about climate change and how we combat climate change. It's about development and creating development opportunities. It's about security. There are so many other aspects to conservation that we've been a little bit blind to. And if we're going to look at generating the financing that's needed to support nature conservation, we can look at things. Biodiversity offsets were trending maybe a decade or two ago, but seem to have fallen back. Well, that's something that African Parks has benefited from. In the Democratic Republic of Congo, there's a mine, it has an impact. There's a biodiversity offset paid to us in Garamba. The whole climate agenda, this whole nature-based solutions is not about planting non-Indigenous species all over the place and sucking up carbon. First and foremost, it's about protecting wild places. This is an investment by the international community in stabilizing the climate. So it's not just a nature conservation thing, it's climate stabilization, adaptation, resilience. Then in terms of development, there are great development opportunities. I know a lot of them have been around the wildlife-based tourism, but we've seen a lot of innovation around and within the parks, new enterprise, honey growing, food growing, sustainable utilization, fishing, etc. And that's generating some local enterprise. And if you can generate the enterprise, the jobs, the investment, then you get local security and the security that you see that goes with that. I've seen that in Kenya in the Northern Rangelands Trust. I've seen it in the many parks I've visited for African parks, where you get investment in protected areas, in nature conservation, you generate decent jobs, you generate opportunity, it brings security for people and wildlife. But we have to change our mindset. This is not just a narrow world of wildlife and conservation. This is about the whole way in which we manage our beautiful planet. It's biodiversity, everything it benefits, how it benefits us, climate and the whole management of our climate change agenda, the development agenda and the security agenda, and very importantly, the health agenda. Max highlighted, there's no problem with animals that contain viruses, etc. The problem is the way we interact with them. We interfere with wild places. We interfere with wild animals by bringing them out, storing them badly, transporting them badly, putting them in markets, selling them. This is a recipe for disaster in terms of future wildlife-related pandemics. So this whole health aspect, which has always been there, as you said from the start, but it wasn't really resonating. Now that's front and center. Invest in nature conservation, biodiversity benefit, climate benefit, development benefit, security benefit, health benefit, and start tapping into those budgets and invest through those budgets in nature conservation. We need a much broader view of this whole agenda.
Max, just to pick up what John's saying there. So, I mean, from your perspective, there's this more joined up thinking that John is articulating so clearly. This goes to a point that you've made about the sort of issue of biodiversity and habitat loss. But you have said, and I've read you talk on this, that we've got to solve the problem of rural poverty and hunger if we're going to actually ever solve this. So, the fact of the matter is that there are people who don't have enough food, who struggle to access resources, don't have land, and are living literally at the edge. How do we deal with that against the backdrop of an industry that has linked itself, or a challenge that has linked itself to an industry which is, frankly, as we all know, because we're all, certainly I'm in the industry, is inherently unstable. Judy pointed it out, John's pointed it out. The seasonality issue is a far wider issue than just the 4 months, the 4 seasons of the years. How do we deal with what John is highlighting? Can we solve this? Do you have any ideas, or how optimistic are you?
Well, I think we can solve it, and I'm very optimistic. I think it's a political economy problem, and it's not a law of physics that's difficult to resolve. It's an issue that by changing our interests and how we interact with each other, we can resolve. John and Judy are quite right in pointing out that we do have a crisis. And I would say that that crisis is actually a metaphor for a sustainability issue that is at the core of our conservation enterprise. And that can be resolved by us coming together and agreeing that what is actually the problem that we're facing here? Because quite often we've gotten distracted by looking at, having an unending discussion around one approach, whether that's hunting or any other thing. And that has quite distracted us and taken us in a direction that's unhelpful. But actually, it hasn't gotten us to resolving the core problem, which is how do we make wildlife management and wildlife itself a legitimate and effective land use option, so that when the choices are to be made about whether we settle for agriculture, human settlement, or any other enterprise in our society, we see wildlife winning the day. Now, where wildlife has been successful, and this is bringing into communities, where wildlife has been successful, we've seen quite 3 or 4 attributes that have been very strong in that. One of them has been around community engagement, and the role that communities play in wildlife management. Now, one might say, why are we focusing on communities and why are they important? Well, across Africa, over 60% of elephant range is outside of state protected areas. And in those areas, it survives on communal land or private land. And it is there because people want it to be there. Now, if we don't focus on making sure that people continue to want it to be there, then it will disappear. And that's what we have not done, whether it's the issues of tenure that Judy has been talking about, or the issues of ensuring that we have an income stream that compensates communities for the damage that wildlife does. While all of us, while where we're sitting, might look at wildlife as things that are beautiful and to be cared for, actually they can be quite dangerous to those who live with them. And communities do face very high costs, whether that is damage to their property or their crops, or actually threats to human life. That has to be compensated somehow. Now, typically we've used conservation revenues from tourism to do that. And as others have said, tourism has dried up and has exposed the weakness of focusing on one issue as a source of funding. Now, we now need and have the space to be saying, how else can we fund the tourism enterprise? And this is where governments must come in as we seek to build back better our economies. And as we are setting aside stimulus packages, we need to be thinking about how much of those can be put into areas where conservation is in crisis and communities need to be in crisis. But public funds alone will not be able to save conservation. We also need to look into tapping into private funding. And this is where you find initiatives such as the Community Conservation Fund for Africa, who I work with, who are trying to make it possible for people who visit the wonderful landscapes in Africa and stay in their hotels to be able to contribute to conservation in Africa. I think those initiatives need to be given a lot more oxygen, and we need to look into how private funding can be used to help in that. So community engagement is very important. There are other aspects, of course, and we can go into the details of which other aspects, like funding, like research and monitoring, like law enforcement. Those are important for the success of the conservation enterprise across Africa. But the one that I would like to highlight today, and which I would encourage all of us to focus on, is what stake do communities have in wildlife? And it shouldn't be a surprise when we live in cities. We find it's so obvious that when I'm living in city, my space is my space and I do whatever I like with it. It is no different with someone who is living in a communal area. They should have the same right to determine what to do with that. And we have an equal obligation to make sure that we're putting the incentives that continues to make them want to live with wildlife.
Let me just pick that up with you, Judy, that I know that, you know, you've built a career around, you know, in tourism, around community-based tourism and conservation. Picking up what Max is saying about the importance of the community. I mean, all of us on here understand that. Do you think that message is being disseminated widely enough? Do you think government understand it? Do you think donors understand it? Is that clear enough to everyone that, I mean, as Max so eloquently put it, you know, those of us who live in an urban environment, we sort of, you know, the street is ours, we know where we're going. And it's the same, obviously, for people who are living in a community. And as Max says, you know, but they're suffering from a whole different set of threats, which are the very things that everyone else is trying to suggest that they should be protecting, i.e., you know, crop loss, hippos running around at night, killing people. You know, we all understand the challenge here. What's your thoughts on that?
Thank you, Mike. I agree with everything that Max says, that we must look at our communities and put them at the center of conservation, because if 60% of our significant wildlife is roaming community lands, then if we are writing policies and strategies without thinking of those communities, we are essentially saying that we are not interested in that 60%.
And Judy, just to, sorry to interrupt you, but just so I understand, because I was also very struck by that statistic. Are you suggesting that policies are being written without the community in mind or the involvement of community-based solutions?
To a large extent, yes. To a large extent, policies are being written. And just, I will go back to the link of conservation and tourism. If you look at a lot of our policies, even in conservation and wildlife, they're thinking mainly about infrastructure, they're thinking about markets, they're thinking about investments, and very little about financing and revenue sources and how to make it sustainable. Just like Max has mentioned. But herein lies the paradox of wildlife in Africa. It is documented, and I will use the case of Kenya. It is even documented within our constitution that this is a national heritage, which means it is technically a common resource that should be accepted and appreciated by everyone. But we have a common resource that is seen by many as an exclusive resource. Those who don't live with it see it as an exclusive resource for tourism. Those who live with it see it as a pain, just like Max has mentioned, because they don't have the freedom that those people who live in the cities have. So this is the paradox of a resource that is supposed to be common, that is not common for people who live in cities who see it as a tourist attraction. For people who live with it, have learned to tolerate it, not to accept it. Communities have learned to tolerate wildlife on their land for many years. Now, this has changed a little bit over the last 15 or so years for Kenya, and I believe for some of the African countries, with the introduction of community managed conservation area, or what they call community conserved areas. In Kenya, we call them community conservancies. This has changed the tolerance into a level of acceptance, but the challenge still remains the instability of linking it to tourism. Conservancies in Masai Mara, I've worked with conservancies in Masai Mara, Kenya for the last more than 10 years. And it was sad to see that within a month of the collapse of tourism, the livelihoods of these thousands of landowners in Masai Mara was just thrown into array. Now, I wanted to imagine what would have happened if what we were telling them, if what conservation was telling them in the past to get rid of their pastoralist lifestyles and depend on wildlife conservation or find other ways of living because livestock was not compatible with wildlife, and because tourism doesn't like wildlife, so tourism says wildlife and livestock. Tourism doesn't like livestock, so they say wildlife and livestock is not compatible. But we have found out that there are compatibilities between livestock and wildlife. Now, if communities had not held on and the conservation models in Masai Mara conservancies had not allowed for pastoralism, we would have been dealing with a community that would have been asking for food aid and all sorts of aid at this time. But because the conservancies were modeled around the livelihoods of the people, so that they could shift from tolerating conservation on wildlife into accepting it as an integrated livelihood, it has actually cushioned the community. We know that they are at some level of need, but it has cushioned them because they could still depend on their livestock to manage their household, get some household income. Although the markets were closed, they can slaughter a goat, they can keep their sheep and feed their families. So when we talk about approaches for making wildlife conservation sustainable in Africa, I always say that the best approach is inclusivity. We will talk about financing, we talk about how do we make this inclusive? When we talk about benefits or opportunities from this industry, how do we make them inclusive? When we talk about the policies from this industry, how do we make it inclusive? Everything around wildlife conservation would have to be inclusive, and that inclusivity would translate this resource that is supposed to be a heritage and a common resource to be accepted, whether with people living in the cities and people living with the wildlife. That disconnect today and that different levels of acceptance and tolerance and all that is what threatens a lot of wildlife conserved areas in Africa. We had the debate of the Nairobi National Park, one of the few parks that you find within a city. The time when the railway line, the standard gauge railway wanted to go through, was proposed to go through Nairobi National Park. And of course it did, because it was a government project. And this project challenge of infrastructure and development and protected areas is a conversation that Africa must begin to have now, because the things that have been traditional threats to conservation are still there, but things like infrastructure development are now becoming a new threat, and it is increasing in many of the developed countries. Now, a number of residents in Nairobi wondered why conservationists were making noise about a railway line going through Nairobi National Park, because for them, that was development. Having a protected area within a city, a land that has got a high economic value for industrial development and other things, did not make sense to them. Yet the Constitution says that wildlife is a national heritage. So at what point does national become national? Is it in a statement or is it in action? I think there are those many disconnects that we find in the whole concept of wildlife conservation and how it's been treated, that makes it very vulnerable and keeps it in that perpetual state of crisis that we spoke about right from the beginning.
It's actually quite remarkable when you disaggregate the situation in the way you just have, Judy, to understand just how sort of challenging and how many paradoxes we've got to try and grapple with. John, I just want to turn to you, and I recognize that we're nearly out of time, but I just want to pick up on the funding, financing side. Obviously, African parks was started by Untitled nearly 20 odd years ago. I mean, how do you see the role of philanthropy in this? Is it part of the solution? Is it something that some governments actually view as a threat? People with a big checkbook running around, or is it something that needs to be really ramped up? You know, it's very striking, particularly in East Africa, to note the number of American philanthropists that are active. Why are we not seeing any Chinese billionaires? Why haven't they been called upon? How does this actually work? This sort of private funding, and is it part of the solution, or is it part of the problem?
No, I think it's part of the solution. I think one thing with the African Parks model that's very important is African Parks as an organisation doesn't own any land anywhere. The state owns the land. Yeah. The state determines the land use. It'll be a protected area and what sort of protected area, and that it invites African Parks to manage it for and on its behalf. And local governance is put in place that involves the government, African Parks and the local community to determine the management direction of that place. It's very important that state sovereignty is preserved, and the role of the state in setting the rules and the engagement with the local community is an integral part of it. I think, and both speakers have said this before, is that moving forward, we have to look at blended finance. We have to look at all avenues of finance. It can't just be government. It can't just be the private sector. It can't just be, multilateral donors, and it can't just be philanthropists. It's going to have to be a blend. And the mix is going to depend where you are at what particular time. But I do think philanthropy will continue to play an important role for some time to come. It's not going to be the only source of finance, but it is going to be an important source. We're going through a period at the moment on the African continent where the business model has just collapsed. So the reliance on wildlife-based tourism was very strong. And as Judy said, as Max said, we put too much reliance on that. But I should say for good reason, because there's not a lot of ways to generate finance through nature conservation. And that's not just within Africa, that's within North America, Latin America, Australasia, wherever you go. How do you generate finance through nature conservation? And wildlife-based tourism has been one option that has worked. It can be done badly, where local people are not involved and have no benefit, and that's actually as bad as poaching and smuggling. Or it can be done very effectively with local communities where benefits are derived and retained locally, which can work well. So that's fallen apart. It will come back, but I don't think anyone will rely on it to the same extent they have before. But how do you generate finance, to pick up Max's point, to have a viable land use option when there are a lot of other land use options that are on the table for governments? Now, one of the advantages of the African Parks model is that when it comes in to look after a place and it stays there for 20 to 50 years, it undertakes to generate the finance. And sometimes government puts a bit in, you generate park revenue fees and tourism fees, but philanthropy and multilateral donors, and I prefer to see them as multilateral investors in nature conservation for multiple local and global benefits, can come in. But you need a good governance model, a focus on place over the long term where multiple donors, multiple sources of finance can come in. But picking up Judy's point, local people, and Max's point, they have to be right at the center of this. There have to be local benefits deriving and direct local engagement in this. So you have to get the model right. But we are going to rely upon multiple sources of financing. I think over the next couple of years, it's going to get really tight. We're at high risk of losing some wonderful wildlife assets if we don't find a way of getting over this dip in revenue over the next couple of years as we recalibrate our financing model. And I think, philanthropy and other external sources of finance are going to be very important at this time.
John, Judy, Max, unfortunately, we've overrun our allotted time, so no surprise there. We could chat on for another half hour or another hour, or probably most of the day. Quite frankly, it's such a vital topic. I think it's fantastic that we've had the three of you here. This is a conference for Africa, about Africa. I think everyone understands that conservation, nature, climate, if we don't get this right this time round, then as you've all made abundantly clear, we are going to be dealing with a crisis that we may entirely lose control of. Thank you all very much for your time. I know you're all in different time zones, and I really hope to meet you all in person, and I really hope we can do this again. I think this is a topic we're going to need to return to, and I'm sure the folks at bench events, we'll make sure that we have the opportunity to pick this up and see how we're doing on the progress front. But it's been really wonderful having you all with us today, and I'm sure the audience will say the same. Thank you so much, and see you somewhere warm and sunny in Africa very soon. Take care, and obviously stay safe.
Thank you, Nick, and thank you for having us. And
Thank you
very much.
Thank you.
Bye, Harry.
Bye. Kwaheri.
cheers, cheers.
Cheers.